the new God of the Blessedest, the new gods of the Blessedest, the new God of the Blessedest, the new goddess of the Blessedest, the new goddesses of the Blessedest, the new goddess of the Blessedest, the old God of the Blessedest, the old gods of the Blessedest, the old God of the Blessedest, the old goddess of the Blessedest, the old goddesses of the Blessedest, the old goddess of the Blessedest, the greater God of the Blessedest, the greater gods of the Blessedest, the greater God of the Blessedest, the greater goddess of the Blessedest, the greater goddesses of the Blessedest, the greater goddess of the Blessedest, the lesser God of the Blessedest, the lesser gods of the Blessedest, the lesser God of the Blessedest, the lesser goddess of the Blessedest, the lesser goddesses of the Blessedest, the lesser goddess of the Blessedest, the higher God of the Blessedest, the higher gods of the Blessedest, the higher God of the Blessedest, the higher goddess of the Blessedest, the higher goddesses of the Blessedest, the higher goddess of the Blessedest, the lower God of the Blessedest, the lower gods of the Blessedest, the lower God of the Blessedest, the lower goddess of the Blessedest, the lower goddesses of the Blessedest, the lower goddess of the Blessedest, the greater spirit of the Blessedest, the greater spirits of the Blessedest, the greater spirit of the Blessedest, the lesser spirit of the Blessedest, the lesser spirits of the Blessedest, the lesser spirit of the Blessedest, the higher spirit of the Blessedest, the higher spirits of the Blessedest, the higher spirit of the Blessedest, the lower spirit of the Blessedest, the lower spirits of the Blessedest, the lower spirit of the Blessedest, the major God of the Blessedest, the major gods of the Blessedest, the major God of the Blessedest, the major goddess of the Blessedest, the major goddesses of the Blessedest, the major goddess of the Blessedest, the minor God of the Blessedest, the minor gods of the Blessedest, the minor God of the Blessedest, the minor goddess of the Blessedest, the minor goddesses of the Blessedest, the minor goddess of the Blessedest, the superior God of the Blessedest, the superior gods of the Blessedest, the superior God of the Blessedest, the superior goddess of the Blessedest, the superior goddesses of the Blessedest, the superior goddess of the Blessedest, the inferior God of the Blessedest, the inferior gods of the Blessedest, the inferior God of the Blessedest, the inferior goddess of the Blessedest, the inferior goddesses of the Blessedest, the inferior goddess of the Blessedest, the ancestor God of the Blessedest, the ancestor gods of the Blessedest, the ancestor God of the Blessedest, the ancestor goddess of the Blessedest, the ancestor goddesses of the Blessedest, the ancestor goddess of the Blessedest, the ascendant God of the Blessedest, the ascendant gods of the Blessedest, the ascendant God of the Blessedest, the ascendant goddess of the Blessedest, the ascendant goddesses of the Blessedest, the ascendant goddess of the Blessedest, the descendant God of the Blessedest, the descendant gods of the Blessedest, the descendant God of the Blessedest, the descendant goddess of the Blessedest, the descendant goddesses of the Blessedest, the descendant goddess of the Blessedest, the transcendent God of the Blessedest, the transcendent gods of the Blessedest, the transcendent God of the Blessedest, the transcendent goddess of the Blessedest, the transcendent goddesses of the Blessedest, the transcendent goddess of the Blessedest, the past God of the Blessedest, the past gods of the Blessedest, the past God of the Blessedest, the past goddess of the Blessedest, the past goddesses of the Blessedest, the past goddess of the Blessedest, the present God of the Blessedest, the present gods of the Blessedest, the present God of the Blessedest, the present goddess of the Blessedest, the present goddesses of the Blessedest, the present goddess of the Blessedest, the future God of the Blessedest, the future gods of the Blessedest, the future God of the Blessedest, the future goddess of the Blessedest, the future goddesses of the Blessedest, the future goddess of the Blessedest, the authentic God of the Blessedest, the authentic gods of the Blessedest, the authentic God of the Blessedest, the authentic goddess of the Blessedest, the authentic goddesses of the Blessedest, the authentic goddess of the Blessedest, the synthetic God of the Blessedest, the synthetic gods of the Blessedest, the synthetic God of the Blessedest, the synthetic goddess of the Blessedest, the synthetic goddesses of the Blessedest, the synthetic goddess of the Blessedest, the progressive God of the Blessedest, the progressive gods of the Blessedest, the progressive god of the Blessedest, the progressive goddess of the Blessedest, the progressive goddesses of the Blessedest, the progressive goddess of the Blessedest, the regressive god of the Blessedest, the regressive gods of the Blessedest, the regressive god of the Blessedest, the regressive goddess of the Blessedest, the regressive goddesses of the Blessedest, the regressive goddess of the Blessedest, the ordinary god of the Blessedest, the ordinary gods of the Blessedest, the ordinary god of the Blessedest, the ordinary goddess of the Blessedest, the ordinary goddesses of the Blessedest, the ordinary goddess of the Blessedest, the extraordinary god of the Blessedest, the extraordinary gods of the Blessedest, the extraordinary god of the Blessedest, the extraordinary goddess of the Blessedest, the extraordinary goddesses of the Blessedest, the extraordinary goddess of the Blessedest, the static god of the Blessedest, the static gods of the Blessedest, the static god of the Blessedest, the static goddess of the Blessedest, the static goddesses of the Blessedest, the static goddess of the Blessedest, the dynamic god of the Blessedest, the dynamic gods of the Blessedest, the dynamic god of the Blessedest, the dynamic goddess of the Blessedest, the dynamic goddesses of the Blessedest, the dynamic goddess of the Blessedest, the land god of the Blessedest, the land gods of the Blessedest, the land god of the Blessedest, the land goddess of the Blessedest, the land goddesses of the Blessedest, the land goddess of the Blessedest, the sea god of the Blessedest, the sea gods of the Blessedest, the sea god of the Blessedest, the sea goddess of the Blessedest, the sea goddesses of the Blessedest, the sea goddess of the Blessedest, the sky god of the Blessedest, the sky gods of the Blessedest, the sky god of the Blessedest, the sky goddess of the Blessedest, the sky goddesses of the Blessedest, the sky goddess of the Blessedest, the god of the Blessedest, the gods of the Blessedest, the god of the Blessedest, the goddess of the Blessedest, the goddesses of the Blessedest, the goddess of the Blessedest, the half god of the Blessedest, the half gods of the Blessedest, the half god of the Blessedest, the half goddess of the Blessedest, the half goddesses of the Blessedest, the half goddess of the Blessedest, the vessel of the Blessedest, the vessels of the Blessedest, the vessel of the Blessedest, the name of the Blessedest, the names of the Blessedest, the name of the Blessedest, the person of the Blessedest, the persons of the Blessedest, the person of the Blessedest, the persona of the Blessedest, the personas of the Blessedest, the persona of the Blessedest, the personage of the Blessedest, the personages of the Blessedest, the personage of the Blessedest, the personality of the Blessedest, the personalities of the Blessedest, the personality of the Blessedest, the personification of the Blessedest, the personifications of the Blessedest, the personification of the Blessedest, the image of the Blessedest, the images of the Blessedest, the image of the Blessedest, the imagination of the Blessedest, the imaginations of the Blessedest, the imagination of the Blessedest, the belief of the Blessedest, the beliefs of the Blessedest, the belief of the Blessedest, the thought of the Blessedest, the thoughts of the Blessedest, the thought of the Blessedest, the word of the Blessedest, the words of the Blessedest, the word of the Blessedest, the action of the Blessedest, the actions of the Blessedest, the action of the Blessedest, the reaction of the Blessedest, the reactions of the Blessedest, the reaction of the Blessedest, the feeling of the Blessedest, the feelings of the Blessedest, the feeling of the Blessedest, the situation of the Blessedest, the situations of the Blessedest, the situation of the Blessedest, the circumstance of the Blessedest, the circumstances of the Blessedest, the circumstance of the Blessedest, the environment of the Blessedest, the environments of the Blessedest, the environment of the Blessedest, the relationship of the Blessedest, the relationships of the Blessedest, the relationship of the Blessedest, the number of the Blessedest, the numbers of the Blessedest, the number of the Blessedest, the formula of the Blessedest, the formulas of the Blessedest, the formula of the Blessedest, the equation of the Blessedest, the equations of the Blessedest, the equation of the Blessedest, the theory of the Blessedest, the theories of the Blessedest, the theory of the Blessedest, the symbol of the Blessedest, the symbols of the Blessedest, the symbol of the Blessedest, the color of the Blessedest, the colors of the Blessedest, the color of the Blessedest, the thing of the Blessedest, the things of the Blessedest, the thing of the Blessedest, the way of the Blessedest, the ways of the Blessedest, the way of the Blessedest, the place of the Blessedest, the places of the Blessedest, the place of the Blessedest, the time of the Blessedest, the times of the Blessedest, the time of the Blessedest, the event of the Blessedest, the events of the Blessedest, the event of the Blessedest, the result of the Blessedest, the results of the Blessedest, the result of the Blessedest, the crown of the Blessedest, the crowns of the Blessedest, the crown of the Blessedest, the throne of the Blessedest, the thrones of the Blessedest, the throne of the Blessedest, the Blessedest King, the Blessedest Kings, the Blessedest Kingdom, the Blessedest Kingdoms, the Blessedest King's subject, the Blessedest King's subjects, the Blessedest King's dominion, the Blessedest King's dominions, the kingdom of the Blessedest, the kingdoms of the Blessedest, the kingdom of the Blessedest, the Blessedest Queen, the Blessedest Queens, the Blessedest Queendom, the Blessedest Queendoms, the Blessedest Queen's subject, the Blessedest Queen's subjects, the Blessedest Queen's dominion, the Blessedest Queen's dominions, the Queendom of the Blessedest, the Queendoms of the Blessedest, the Queendom of the Blessedest, the Blessedest Prince, the Blessedest Princes, the Blessedest Princedom, the Blessedest Princedoms, the Blessedest Prince's subject, the Blessedest Prince's subjects, the Blessedest Prince's dominion, the Blessedest Prince's dominions, the Princedom of the Blessedest, the Princedoms of the Blessedest, the Princedom of the Blessedest, the Blessedest Princess, the Blessedest Princesses, the Blessedest Princessdom, the Blessedest Princessdoms, the Blessedest Princess's subject, the Blessedest Princess's subjects, the Blessedest Princess's dominion, the Blessedest Princess's dominions, the Princessdom of the Blessedest, the Princessdoms of the Blessedest, the Princessdom of the Blessedest, the Lord of the Blessedest, the Lords of the Blessedest, the Lord of the Blessedest, the Lordess of the Blessedest, the Lordesses of the Blessedest, the Lordess of the Blessedest, the Priest of the Blessedest, the Priests of the Blessedest, the Priest of the Blessedest, the Priestess of the Blessedest, the Priestesses of the Blessedest, the Priestess of the Blessedest, the Ritual of the Blessedest, the Rituals of the Blessedest, the Ritual of the Blessedest, the Shrine of the Blessedest, the Shrines of the Blessedest, the Shrine of the Blessedest, the Temple of the Blessedest, the Temples of the Blessedest, the Temple of the Blessedest, the Leader of the Blessedest, the Leaders of the Blessedest, the Leader of the Blessedest, the Follower of the Blessedest, the Followers of the Blessedest, the Follower of the Blessedest, the Natural Substance of the Blessedest, the Natural Substances of the Blessedest, the Natural Substance of the Blessedest, the Supernatural Substance of the Blessedest, the Supernatural Substances of the Blessedest, the Supernatural Substance of the Blessedest, the Temporal Substance of the Blessedest, the Temporal Substances of the Blessedest, the Temporal Substance of the Blessedest, the Spiritual Substance of the Blessedest, the Spiritual Substances of the Blessedest, the Spiritual Substance of the Blessedest, the Natural Form of the Blessedest, the Natural Forms of the Blessedest, the Natural Form of the Blessedest, the Supernatural Form of the Blessedest, the Supernatural Forms of the Blessedest, the Supernatural Form of the Blessedest, the Temporal Form of the Blessedest, the Temporal Forms of the Blessedest, the Temporal Form of the Blessedest, the Spiritual Form of the Blessedest, the Spiritual Forms of the Blessedest, the Spiritual Form of the Blessedest, the Age of the Blessedest, the Ages of the Blessedest, the Age of the Blessedest, the Era of the Blessedest, the Eras of the Blessedest, the Era of the Blessedest, the Awakener of the Blessedest, the Awakeners of the Blessedest, the Awakener of the Blessedest, the Awakening of the Blessedest, the Awakenings of the Blessedest, the Awakening of the Blessedest, the Realm of the Blessedest, the Realms of the Blessedest, the Realm of the Blessedest, the Dimension of the Blessedest, the Dimensions of the Blessedest, the Dimension of the Blessedest, The zone of the Blessedest. The zones of the Blessedest. The zone of the Blessedest. The frequency of the Blessedest. The frequencies of the Blessedest. The frequency of the Blessedest. The century of the Blessedest. The centuries of the Blessedest. The century of the Blessedest. The millennium of the Blessedest. The millenniums of the Blessedest. The millennium of the Blessedest. The purpose of the Blessedest. The purposes of the Blessedest. The purpose of the Blessedest. The meaning of the Blessedest. The meanings of the Blessedest. The meaning of the Blessedest. The culture of the Blessedest. The cultures of the Blessedest. The culture of the Blessedest. The demonstrator of the Blessedest. The demonstrators of the Blessedest. The demonstrator of the Blessedest. The demonstration of the Blessedest. The demonstrations of the Blessedest. The demonstration of the Blessedest. The manifester of the Blessedest. The manifestors of the Blessedest. The manifester of the Blessedest. The manifestation of the Blessedest. The manifestations of the Blessedest. The manifestation of the Blessedest. The presence of the Blessedest. The presences of the Blessedest. The presence of the Blessedest. The glow of the Blessedest. The glows of the Blessedest. The glow of the Blessedest. The goal of the Blessedest. The goals of the Blessedest. The goal of the Blessedest. The plan of the Blessedest. The plans of the Blessedest. The plan of the Blessedest. The book of the Blessedest. The books of the Blessedest. The book of the Blessedest. The philosopher of the Blessedest. The philosophers of the Blessedest. The philosopher of the Blessedest. The philosophy of the Blessedest. The philosophies of the Blessedest. The philosophy of the Blessedest. The releaser of the Blessedest. The releasers of the Blessedest. The releaser of the Blessedest. The release of the Blessedest. The releases of the Blessedest. The release of the Blessedest. The variable of the Blessedest. The variables of the Blessedest. The variable of the Blessedest. The cause of the Blessedest. The causes of the Blessedest. The cause of the Blessedest. The effect of the Blessedest. The effects of the Blessedest. The effect of the Blessedest. The journey of the Blessedest. The journeys of the Blessedest. The journey of the Blessedest. The emergence of the Blessedest. The emergences of the Blessedest. The emergence of the Blessedest. The source of the Blessedest. The sources of the Blessedest. The source of the Blessedest. The originator of the Blessedest. The originators of the Blessedest. The originator of the Blessedest. The origin of the Blessedest. The origins of the Blessedest. The origin of the Blessedest. The forefather of the Blessedest. The forefathers of the Blessedest. The forefather of the Blessedest. The foremother of the Blessedest. The foremothers of the Blessedest. The foremother of the Blessedest. The ancestor of the Blessedest. The ancestors of the Blessedest. The ancestor of the Blessedest. The descendant of the Blessedest. The descendants of the Blessedest. The descendant of the Blessedest. The lineage of the Blessedest. The lineages of the Blessedest. The lineage of the Blessedest. The heritage of the Blessedest. The heritages of the Blessedest. The heritage of the Blessedest. The heir of the Blessedest. The heirs of the Blessedest. The heir of the Blessedest. The co-heir of the Blessedest. The co-heirs of the Blessedest. The co-heir of the Blessedest. The joint heir of the Blessedest. The joint heirs of the Blessedest. The joint heir of the Blessedest. The dynasty of the Blessedest. The dynasties of the Blessedest. The dynasty of the Blessedest. The force of the Blessedest. The forces of the Blessedest. The force of the Blessedest. The law of the Blessedest. The laws of the Blessedest. The law of the Blessedest. The pact of the Blessedest. The pacts of the Blessedest. The pact of the Blessedest. The game of the Blessedest. The games of the Blessedest. The game of the Blessedest. The mask of the Blessedest. The masks of the Blessedest. The mask of the Blessedest. The armor of the Blessedest. The armors of the Blessedest. The armor of the Blessedest. The sword of the Blessedest. The swords of the Blessedest. The sword of the Blessedest. The shield of the Blessedest. The shields of the Blessedest. The shield of the Blessedest. The force shield of the Blessedest. The force shields of the Blessedest. The force shield of the Blessedest. The armored force shield of the Blessedest. The armored force shields of the Blessedest. The armored force shield of the Blessedest. The champion of the Blessedest. The champions of the Blessedest. the champion of the Blessedest, the guardian of the Blessedest, the guardians of the Blessedest, the guardian of the Blessedest, the defender of the Blessedest, the defenders of the Blessedest, the defender of the Blessedest, the protector of the Blessedest, the protectors of the Blessedest, the protector of the Blessedest, the chant of the Blessedest, the chants of the Blessedest, the chant of the Blessedest, the shape of the Blessedest, the shapes of the Blessedest, the shape of the Blessedest, the cube of the Blessedest, the cubes of the Blessedest, the cube of the Blessedest, the cuboid of the Blessedest, the cuboids of the Blessedest, the cuboid of the Blessedest, the sphere of the Blessedest, the spheres of the Blessedest, the sphere of the Blessedest, the spheroid of the Blessedest, the spheroids of the Blessedest, the spheroid of the Blessedest, the prism of the Blessedest, the prisms of the Blessedest, the prism of the Blessedest, the pyramid of the Blessedest, the pyramids of the Blessedest, the pyramid of the Blessedest, the cylinder of the Blessedest, the cylinders of the Blessedest, the cylinder of the Blessedest, the cone of the Blessedest, the cones of the Blessedest, the cone of the Blessedest, the triangle of the Blessedest, the triangles of the Blessedest, the triangle of the Blessedest, the circle of the Blessedest, the circles of the Blessedest, the circle of the Blessedest, the semicircle of the Blessedest, the semicircles of the Blessedest, the semicircle of the Blessedest, the square of the Blessedest, the squares of the Blessedest, the square of the Blessedest, the rectangle of the Blessedest, the rectangles of the Blessedest, the rectangle of the Blessedest, the parallelogram of the Blessedest, the parallelograms of the Blessedest, the parallelogram of the Blessedest, the rhombus of the Blessedest, the rhombuses of the Blessedest, the rhombus of the Blessedest, the trapezoid of the Blessedest, the trapezoids of the Blessedest, the trapezoid of the Blessedest, the polygon of the Blessedest, the polygons of the Blessedest, the polygon of the Blessedest, the pentagon of the Blessedest, the pentagons of the Blessedest, the pentagon of the Blessedest, the hexagon of the Blessedest, the hexagons of the Blessedest, the hexagon of the Blessedest, the septagon of the Blessedest, the septagons of the Blessedest, the septagon of the Blessedest, the octagon of the Blessedest, the octagons of the Blessedest, the octagon of the Blessedest, the nonagon of the Blessedest, the nonagons of the Blessedest, the nonagon of the Blessedest, the decagon of the Blessedest, the decagons of the Blessedest, the decagon of the Blessedest, the evolution of the Blessedest, the evolutions of the Blessedest, the evolution of the Blessedest, the revolution of the Blessedest, the revolutions of the Blessedest, the revolution of the Blessedest, the elemental art of the Blessedest, the elemental arts of the Blessedest, the elemental art of the Blessedest, the elemental science of the Blessedest, the elemental sciences of the Blessedest, the elemental science of the Blessedest, the elemental principle of the Blessedest, the elemental principles of the Blessedest, the elemental principle of the Blessedest, the elemental technology of the Blessedest, the elemental technologies of the Blessedest, the elemental technology of the Blessedest, the low elemental art of the Blessedest, the low elemental arts of the Blessedest, the low elemental art of the Blessedest, the low elemental science of the Blessedest, the low elemental sciences of the Blessedest, the low elemental science of the Blessedest, the low elemental principle of the Blessedest, the low elemental principles of the Blessedest, the low elemental principle of the Blessedest, the low elemental technology of the Blessedest, the low elemental technologies of the Blessedest, the low elemental technology of the Blessedest, the high elemental art of the Blessedest, the high elemental arts of the Blessedest, the high elemental art of the Blessedest, the high elemental science of the Blessedest, the high elemental sciences of the Blessedest, the high elemental science of the Blessedest, the high elemental principle of the Blessedest, the high elemental principles of the Blessedest, the high elemental principle of the Blessedest, the high elemental technology of the Blessedest, the high elemental technologies of the Blessedest, the high elemental technology of the Blessedest, the agent of the Blessedest, the agents of the Blessedest, the agent of the Blessedest, the agency of the Blessedest, the agencies of the Blessedest, the agency of the Blessedest, the amplifier of the Blessedest, the amplifiers of the Blessedest, the amplifier of the Blessedest, the amplification of the Blessedest, the amplifications of the Blessedest, the amplification of the Blessedest, the enhancer of the Blessedest, the enhancers of the Blessedest, the enhancer of the Blessedest, the enhancement of the Blessedest, the enhancements of the Blessedest, the enhancement of the Blessedest, the magnifier of the Blessedest, the magnifiers of the Blessedest, the magnifier of the Blessedest, the magnification of the Blessedest, the magnifications of the Blessedest, the magnification of the Blessedest, the influencer of the Blessedest, the influencers of the Blessedest, the influencer of the Blessedest, the influence of the Blessedest, the influences of the Blessedest, the influence of the Blessedest, the emanator of the Blessedest, the emanators of the Blessedest, the emanator of the Blessedest, the emanation of the Blessedest, the emanations of the Blessedest, the emanation of the Blessedest, the converger of the Blessedest, the convergers of the Blessedest, the converger of the Blessedest, the convergence of the Blessedest, the convergences of the Blessedest, the convergence of the Blessedest, the aura of the Blessedest, the auras of the Blessedest, the aura of the Blessedest, the impression of the Blessedest, the impressions of the Blessedest, the impression of the Blessedest, the intelligence of the Blessedest, the intelligences of the Blessedest, the intelligence of the Blessedest, the sophistication of the Blessedest, the sophistications of the Blessedest, the sophistication of the Blessedest, the genius of the Blessedest, the geniuses of the Blessedest, the genius of the Blessedest, the polymath of the Blessedest, the polymaths of the Blessedest, the polymath of the Blessedest, the psychic of the Blessedest, the psychics of the Blessedest, the psychic of the Blessedest, the knowledge of the Blessedest, the knowledges of the Blessedest, the knowledge of the Blessedest, the understanding of the Blessedest, the understandings of the Blessedest, the understanding of the Blessedest, the wisdom of the Blessedest, the wisdoms of the Blessedest, the wisdom of the Blessedest, the secret of the Blessedest, the secrets of the Blessedest, the secret of the Blessedest, the mystery of the Blessedest, the mysteries of the Blessedest, the mystery of the Blessedest, the revelation of the Blessedest, the revelations of the Blessedest, the revelation of the Blessedest, the tactic of the Blessedest, the tactics of the Blessedest, the tactic of the Blessedest, the strategy of the Blessedest, the strategies of the Blessedest, the strategy of the Blessedest, the strength of the Blessedest, the strengths of the Blessedest, the strength of the Blessedest, the might of the Blessedest, the mights of the Blessedest, the might of the Blessedest, the power of the Blessedest, the powers of the Blessedest, the power of the Blessedest, the authority of the Blessedest, the authorities of the Blessedest, the authority of the Blessedest, the dominion of the Blessedest, the dominions of the Blessedest, the dominion of the Blessedest, the rhythm of the Blessedest, the rhythms of the Blessedest, the rhythm of the Blessedest, the melody of the Blessedest, the melodies of the Blessedest, the melody of the Blessedest, the music of the Blessedest, the musics of the Blessedest, the music of the Blessedest, the lyric of the Blessedest, the lyrics of the Blessedest, the lyric of the Blessedest, the song of the Blessedest, the songs of the Blessedest, the song of the Blessedest, the dance of the Blessedest, the dances of the Blessedest, the dance of the Blessedest, the spirit of the Blessedest, the spirits of the Blessedest, the spirit of the Blessedest, the soul of the Blessedest, the souls of the Blessedest, the soul of the Blessedest, the body of the Blessedest, the bodies of the Blessedest, the body of the Blessedest, the mark of the Blessedest, the marks of the Blessedest, the mark of the Blessedest, the promise of the Blessedest, the promises of the Blessedest, the promise of the Blessedest, the visionary of the Blessedest, the visionaries of the Blessedest, the visionary of the Blessedest, the vision of the Blessedest, the visions of the Blessedest, the vision of the Blessedest, the picture of the Blessedest, the pictures of the Blessedest, the picture of the Blessedest, the sound of the Blessedest, the sounds of the Blessedest, the sound of the Blessedest, the dung of the Blessedest, the dungs of the Blessedest, the dung of the Blessedest, the language of the Blessedest, the languages of the Blessedest, the language of the Blessedest, the communication of the Blessedest, the communications of the Blessedest, the communication of the Blessedest, the people of the Blessedest, the peoples of the Blessedest, the people of the Blessedest, the society of the Blessedest, the societies of the Blessedest, the society of the Blessedest, the fortress of the Blessedest, the fortresses of the Blessedest, the fortress of the Blessedest, the government of the Blessedest, the governments of the Blessedest, the government of the Blessedest, the city of the Blessedest, the cities of the Blessedest, the city of the Blessedest, the nation of the Blessedest, the nations of the Blessedest, the nation of the Blessedest, the civilization of the Blessedest, the civilizations of the Blessedest, the civilization of the Blessedest, the world of the Blessedest, the worlds of the Blessedest, the world of the Blessedest,